The wind blows cold over the Strait of Georgia. Between the rocky coast of what is now Washington State and Vancouver Island lies a cluster of small islands covered in pines, fog, and silence, the San Juan Islands. At first glance they seem like a forgotten dot on the map, an archipelago that shouldn't matter much. Yet in the 19th century that insignificant point turned into a diplomatic time bomb between two powers that had already tested each other's strength in the past, the United States and the British Empire. To understand how a dead pig almost started a war, one must go back to the years following American independence, after the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ended the Revolution. The boundaries between the United States and the northern British colonies remained blurred, poorly drawn, and disputed. The Pacific Northwest was a remote region, scarcely explored and almost devoid of European presence. For decades, maps were vague, agreements ambiguous, and ambitions endless. By the mid-19th century, both the British and the Americans had set their sights on that distant frontier. The British, through the Hudson's Bay Company, controlled much of the fur trade in the area. The Americans, driven by the expansionist fever of manifest destiny, sought to push their border as far north as possible. Reaching the Pacific, the problem lay in a single line. Where exactly did the border between the two nations run? The Oregon Treaty of 1846, intended to end the dispute, stated that the boundary would follow the 49th parallel to the sea, and from there through the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island to the Pacific Ocean, a phrase that sounded reasonable until geographers realized there was more than one channel separating Vancouver Island from the mainland, one to the east, another to the west, and in between, the San Juan Islands. Each side interpreted the treaty in its own way. For the British, the line ran through the Rosario Strait, which placed the islands under their control, while for the Americans it should follow the Harrow Strait, further west, which would make them part of their territory. Thus, those small islands, barely 150 square kilometers in total, became a space of disputed sovereignty, a political limbo where settlers from both sides, retired soldiers, sailors, and traders coexisted, a patch of land without a defined flag, yet with enough tension to ignite a spark. For years, both empires maintained a sort of tacit truce, each asserting its sovereignty in symbolic ways. The British kept a sheep station run by the Hudson's Bay Company, while the Americans, a handful of farmers from the continent, began claiming plots and planting potatoes, wheat, and maize. It was an uneasy coexistence, but a relatively peaceful one. No one wanted to provoke an incident, and the government in Washington had other priorities. The country was expanding, absorbing territories, and the Civil War was still beyond the horizon. The British Empire, for its part, watched from afar, more concerned with India and its Asian colonies than with a few islands shrouded in mist. Yet beneath the apparent calm, something was growing. The tension fed on every argument over a fence, every animal that wandered onto a neighbor's land, every new family arriving to claim an American or British plot. And so, in that remote landscape where the dividing line was as ambiguous as the morning fog, history awaited its most unlikely protagonist, a pig, a fat, well-fed pig belonging to a British employee, and a stubborn man with a rifle who wasn't about to let anyone, not even a foreign pig, eat his potatoes. What no one imagined was that this single shot, fired in the middle of an obscure farm, would shake the chancelleries of two empires. In the summer of 1859, the San Juan Islands were a quiet, albeit lonely, place. There were no towns, no roads, not even a clear authority, only fields, forests, and a handful of scattered farms. Among these settlers lived Lyman Cutler, an American man born in Kentucky, strong-willed, rough, accustomed to frontier life. He had arrived on the island a few years earlier, seeking a fertile piece of land where he could settle. He was neither a wealthy man nor a legendary pioneer, but he represented the spirit of many Americans of his time, the belief that land should belong to those who worked it. Lyman cultivated potatoes, a simple but essential crop in those damp lands. His days passed between work and solitude, with the occasional company of other settlers. On the nearby hill lived Charles Griffin, an Irishman employed by the Hudson's Bay Company, the powerful British entity controlling trade in the region. Griffin tended a small sheep and pig farm on behalf of the company, and although he held no military authority, his presence somehow represented the British flag over these disputed islands. Both men knew they were living on uncertain ground, but each believed they were on legitimate territory. To Cutler, this was American land; to Griffin, British, and so they coexisted with tense courtesy, an invisible border marked only by custom and pride. The problem began with a pig, but in reality, It was something deeper, the sum of years of distrust, overlapping sovereignties, poorly drawn maps, and national egos. The pig in question was large, black, and gluttonous. It belonged to Griffin and often roamed freely over the hills, rummaging through settlers' gardens. To Lyman Cutlar, it had a special fondness for his potatoes. Day after day, the animal sneaked into his plot, dug up the soil, and devoured the plants. Cutlar chased it, shouted at it, tried to scare it off, but nothing worked. To him, that pig was a provocation on four legs, a symbol of British presence on what he considered his land. One June morning, fed up with seeing his garden ruined, he took his rifle and decided to put an end to the problem. The pig crossed the fence again, and Cutlar, without overthinking it, aimed and fired. The pig fell. Immediately, one shot, one scream, and the beginning of an international crisis. When Charles Griffin found out, he flew into a rage. He marched straight to Cutlar's cabin and demanded compensation of $100. A huge sum at the time. Cutlar, outraged, refused. He said the pig had invaded his property and that he had the right to defend his crops. The two men argued heatedly, each invoking their own law, British or American, but in reality, neither law had clear jurisdiction over that territory. What seemed a simple neighborly dispute quickly took on another dimension when Griffin reported the incident to his superiors at the Hudson's Bay Company. They, in turn, contacted the British authorities on nearby Vancouver Island, warning that an American citizen had killed British property. The response was swift. The British demanded Cutlar's arrest and the payment of compensation. When the news reached the American settlers on the island, outrage erupted. In their eyes, the incident was not about a pig but about the right to be there. Allowing the British to arrest one of their own would mean accepting that they lived under foreign authority. Thus, what had begun as a farm quarrel became a question of national sovereignty. Cutlar became a sort of local hero, a symbol of American resistance on the disputed islands. Meanwhile, across the strait, the British authorities prepared a more formal response. Within days, reports and messages crossed the sea, and both in Vancouver and Washington there was talk of reinforcements, patrols, and flags. No one yet knew it, but Cutlar's shot had echoed beyond the forest, beyond the channel, and was already reverberating in the chancelleries. It was the era of telegraphs and imperial rivalries, where even a minor incident could escalate to the brink of absurdity. Yet what truly lit the fuse was not the shot itself, but national pride. In the 19th century, no power was willing to appear weak in the face of another, and if a simple pig was enough to test the firmness of sovereignty, then it was worth defending, even with arms. Thus, the men of the pig, Cutlar and Griffin, became, unwillingly, the opening pieces on a much larger board, one where armies would soon move, ships would anchor off the coast, and the fate of an entire archipelago would hinge on the memory of a shot that, at the time, seemed insignificant. As the American soldiers camped and stood guard around Cutlar's property, information traveled in the opposite direction, and in the British naval officers' orders were drafted to send ships to reinforce imperial presence. Sailors prepared, British officers discussed protocols and jurisdictions, and it was not just an exchange of forces, it was a symbolic encounter. Flags, banners, anthems, all that which turns a piece of land into a flag and a flag into a demanding symbol. And amidst this military choreography, life on the island became a staged piece, where every movement could be interpreted as provocation or defense. The settlers, who previously argued over fences and potatoes, now practiced speeches, firm glances, and silent slogans for any outsider who asked about their loyalty. Piquet recognized the delicacy of his role. It was not about invading, but witnessing, maintaining his country's informational presence and ensuring that, in case of escalation, the official account could say here there was legitimate American presence, and thus his command was careful. He ordered limited patrols, strict non-provocation rules, and maneuvers calculated not to appear belligerent. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy did not fall behind in gestures of authority. Their intimidating ships anchored in coves visible from the shore. Officers observed, measured, and sent diplomatic letters demanding justice for their citizen. What complicated matters was the absence of a local arbiter with real power, because neither the Hudson's Bay Company nor the colonial authorities intended or were able to resolve the dispute definitively, and the chancelleries had to decide whether a lesson in firmness was enough or if imperial honor required a more forceful action. For weeks the island became a small-scale chessboard, with pieces including foot patrols, discreet naval maneuvers, letters, claims, and tense encounters between settlers, and in each meeting rhetoric rose like a pot heating without anyone touching the lid. The most troubling part was that almost no one in the decision-making levels truly wanted a larger conflict, but almost everyone felt that yielding would equate to a political defeat with long-term cost. In Washington, the White House and State Department consulted military and legal advisors, seeking a solution that preserved dignity without risking troops in a European-style conflict, and in London the Foreign Office debated how to respond to an affront without turning the incident into a costly precedent. This normative and emotional friction is what turned a pig into a global problem, because in the 19th century reputation was political currency, and any doubt about who ruled a territory, no matter how small, was interpreted as weakness, and weakness was something no empire could afford before public opinion and rival powers. On the island, Piquet held a series of meetings with local leaders, men who sought not glory but security for their families. He spoke calmly, delegated tasks, advised against direct confrontations, and maintained strict discipline among his men. His instruction was simple: deter, do not provoke. Coastal press began to take interest. Letters reached newspapers that enjoyed sensationalizing frontier clashes, and the public narrative was shaped in both nations. Some minor columnists called for firmness and others for prudence, but both fed the fire, and political rhetoric amplified the perception of risk. Beneath that public theater, discreet negotiations occurred through diplomatic channels. Emissaries sought to lower tensions without humiliating either side, and those conversations, though secret, were slow, because distance, telegraph times, and care with words meant that each message took time and each reception was read several times before responding. The waiting increased anxiety, and on the island life continued with the routine of those who know they are being watched. Farmers repaired fences, children still played on beaches, sheep grazed as if history had no intention of swallowing them, yet psychological tension resided in the nights when fires went out with glances that measured the neighbor's resolve. And in the mornings, when Piquet sent patrols, settlers of both sides crossed paths in silence, none wishing to speak first, for the first insult could be taken as the first hostile act, and so, while the world watched from afar, the island experienced an agonizing calm where war seemed a rational possibility and simultaneously an absurd catastrophe, both options coexisting like clouds on the horizon. What ultimately prevented the conflict from turning into a bloodbath was the prudence of some officers, the understanding that a war over a local incident would be disproportionate and costly, and the existence of diplomatic channels that, although slow, functioned to contain the escalation. Piquet realized then that his mission was not to win a battle but to prevent it, and with that goal he maintained order until the voices in the cabinets gradually found formulas for dialogue, and that fragile, temporary balance showed that sometimes military firmness combined with political restraint can avert disaster, a lesson future generations would remember as an example of how reason can prevail when pride pushes toward the precipice. Finally, the island returned to a vigilant routine, with reduced forces and still watchful eyes, but with the sense that, for now, calamity had been avoided, and in that respite lay the certainty that sovereignty is not just a matter of maps and proclamations but of human decisions that can ignite or extinguish the flame of war. As the waves struck the rocky shores of the San Juan Islands and the smoke from the campfires mingled with the mist, in the capitals of both empires the pig matter began to grow like an unexpected shadow. What had started with a shot and a dead pig was now discussed at government tables with maps unfurled and advisors speaking of treaties, jurisdictions, and potential confrontations. In Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan received the first reports with a mixture of irritation and concern. The country was still trying to maintain its fragile internal balance, with political tensions threatening to divide the nation, and the last thing it needed was a war with Britain over such an absurd incident. Yet, ignoring it would also be interpreted as weakness, and Buchanan knew that every move was being watched by an increasingly impatient press. In those days, national pride was as inflammable as gunpowder. In London, the Foreign Office received the same reports with indignation. A British subject had been wronged and American troops had landed on territory which, according to their maps, belonged to the Crown. For British diplomats, this was no minor matter, it was a direct affront to imperial authority in North America. In their meetings, the tone swung between anger and prudence, between those demanding an immediate military response and those recommending calm. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but no one truly desired war over a pig. Still, in the logic of empires, pride was more costly than bullets, and the possibility of appearing weak before a young republic like the United States was almost intolerable. In Vancouver, Governor James Douglas, a man experienced in colonial politics, received orders from London with room for interpretation. Douglas had lived long enough on the margins of empire to understand that distance and communication errors could turn an order into tragedy. Nevertheless, his first reaction was firm. He ordered 3 British warships to head to the San Juan Islands to show presence and support the British settlers. These ships were the HMS Tribune, the HMS Satellite, and the HMS Plumper, imposing vessels for such a small stage, but enough to intimidate any enemy detachment. When the sails appeared on the horizon and the metallic silhouettes of the ships cut against the fog, the settlers realized the matter had escalated. What had until then been a neighborly dispute had become a display of force. On land, Piquet observed the ships with furrowed brow, aware that any mistake could trigger crossfire. He ordered positions reinforced, trenches dug, and arms ready, yet insisted that no one fire first. If a shot is fired, let it be because they fire first, he reportedly commanded. The British, for their part, awaited clearer instructions from Vancouver, in the meantime limiting themselves to patrolling the waters, being seen, and asserting naval superiority. The days grew tense. At night, the flashes of lamps on the ships reflected on the sea like watchful eyes, and the soldiers on land slept with rifles within reach. Settlers counted the hours and rumors traveled faster than the winds through the channel. There was talk of an imminent attack, reinforcements coming from the mainland, officers preparing secret orders, yet the reality was subtler. Both sides were measuring each other, testing resolve, seeing how far the enemy's determination stretched without crossing the point of no return. In Washington, General Winfield Scott, a veteran of the Mexican War, was called to mediate the situation. Scott was an imposing, prudent man with experience in diplomatic crises. His reputation as a peacemaker was as solid as his military discipline. President Buchanan entrusted him with a delicate mission: travel to the northwest and resolve the conflict before a drop of blood was shed. Scott immediately understood the gravity of the matter. A war over a pig would be the most ridiculous of wars, he is said to have remarked, and he was right. However, he also knew that the most absurd conflicts were the easiest to spiral out of control. At sea, British captains were ordered to maintain calm, but with a caveat: not to allow Americans to build permanent fortifications or expand their presence. Thus, every movement was closely watched. When a group of soldiers dug a trench or erected a palisade, the British approached with their cannons aimed, without firing, but making it clear they were ready. On one such day, a British officer and an American officer met face to face in a small cove. They greeted politely, exchanged a few words, and then withdrew, each with pride intact. It was a moment that summed up the entire situation: 2 empires looking at each other with respect and threat simultaneously, knowing a misdirected bullet could drag thousands to death. Meanwhile, newspapers began to sensationalize the story. In the United States, headlines spoke of the defense of American honor against British aggression. In London, editorials clamored for a firm response to the insolence of a nation yet to understand the weight of diplomacy. Each headline inflamed passions, each account exaggerated events, and public opinion, on both sides, began to view the conflict with a mix of patriotic pride and morbid curiosity. On the island, Piquet received news that General Scott was on his way and breathed a sigh of relief. He knew his position was untenable if the British ships decided to attack. His men numbered only a few hundred, lightly armed, against a fleet that could wipe them off the map in minutes, yet he maintained his resolve, telling his soldiers to behave with dignity, representing their country in every gesture. The following weeks were a choreography of vigilance and diplomacy. Flags waved firmly, weapons remained clean, orders repeated like prayers: do not provoke, do not retreat. In the air hovered a sense of the absurd, as if all were aware they were living through a dangerous comedy scripted by history. When General Scott finally arrived, he was received with respect by both sides. A man of imposing presence, tall, impeccably uniformed, and with an authority-inspiring demeanor. His first action was to request a meeting with the British officers, and in that encounter, held in a makeshift tent with maps spread across a wooden table, he uttered a phrase that would go down in history: 2 great nations must not go to war over a pig. The British, surprised by his frankness, agreed to discuss a temporary solution. It was decided that both countries would maintain joint occupation of the island until the sovereignty dispute was resolved diplomatically. Each side would have a small military detachment. Both would live on opposite sides of the island, and clear rules of coexistence were established. There would be no cross arrests, no provocations, no interference. It was a solution as unusual as it was effective, the sort of permanent truce amidst the fog. With that agreement, the conflict was suspended, and although tension never fully disappeared, the possibility of open war slowly dissipated into the damp Pacific air. Years later, when the incident became fodder for jokes in cafes and newspapers, some would say the pig had died for the sake of peace, but at that moment, as the ships returned to port and the troops withdrew to safer positions, no one laughed. All knew they had been on the brink, and that a hungry animal had been enough to remind the world how fragile civilization can be when pride dons the guise of a flag. The Salish Sea glimmered beneath a thick fog, as if the waves were keeping secrets that no witness was meant to hear. The San Juan Islands had become the board of a game of power far greater than a mere border dispute. On the surface, it all revolved around a dead pig, but in truth, that spark ignited a tension that had been growing between two empires competing for dominance in the Pacific, the United States and the United Kingdom. In 1859, the world was changing. European powers were expanding their colonies while North America sought to define its own map. The United States had not yet entered the Civil War, but already considered itself a nation with manifest destiny, convinced it must stretch from sea to shining sea. The British, meanwhile, watched cautiously as this young country grew at an unstoppable pace. Canada did not yet exist as a unified nation. It was a collection of British colonies, with a strong naval presence and a population loyal to the crown. Between them, the northwest of the continent was a nebulous terrain, a frontier without clear lines. The San Juan Islands, situated between Vancouver Island and the continental United States, lay right in the middle of the dilemma. According to the Oregon Treaty of 1846, the border was meant to follow the channel separating the continent from Vancouver Island, but there was a small detail: there were actually two navigable channels, the Haro Strait and the Rosario Strait. None of the negotiators of that treaty had specified which was the correct channel, and that legal void left the door open to conflict. For Americans, the border should run through the Haro Strait, placing the San Juan Islands on their side. The British, however, insisted on the Rosario Strait, which placed the islands under British sovereignty. In practice, both nations began colonizing them simultaneously, as if the other did not exist. For years, this created an awkward coexistence. American settlers shared the same land with British farmers, all attempting to maintain appearances. British warships occasionally anchored near the shores, while Americans raised small farms as a silent declaration of ownership. But a single incident, a shot, an insult, a dead pig, was enough to make everything collapse, and that is exactly what happened. After Lyman Cutler's shot, tension spread like wildfire. American settlers requested protection from their army, convinced that British authorities intended to arrest Cutler as a pretext to impose control over the island. General William Harney, a military man known for his impulsive nature, wasted no time. He ordered a full company of the United States Army under Captain George Pickett, who would later become infamous for his disastrous charge at Gettysburg, arrived on the island with around 60 soldiers, cannons, and a determination that bordered on arrogance. On the British side, the response was equally formidable. 3 warships under Captain Geoffrey Hornby anchored off the island. Each carried dozens of cannons and hundreds of sailors. Within days, a small potato farm had become the most tense spot on the planet. Flags waved in opposite directions, trenches were dug, and men awaited the order to open fire. A single shot, a misunderstanding, could escalate the conflict into a full-scale war between the two most powerful English-speaking nations of the 19th century. Yet something prevented this madness from unfolding. It was not the diplomacy of the governments in Washington or London, but the common sense of the men on the ground. Both Pickett and Hornby understood that no one wanted to be responsible for starting a war over a pig. Despite the tension, the officers began to converse, exchanging letters and cautious visits. They even shared supplies at times, a tacit truce that defied orders from above. Meanwhile, the world watched with curiosity and bewilderment. Newspapers in New York and London published ridiculous headlines about the most absurd war of the century. Deep down, they knew the incident was no laughing matter. It demonstrated how fragile peace could be between two nations competing for the same space, resources, and global influence. In North America, any territorial dispute could turn into armed conflict. In the summer of 1859, tension reached its peak. Over 400 American soldiers occupied the island, while the British Navy had enough cannons trained on land to level the territory. For weeks, both sides held their positions, neither attacking nor retreating. Each dawn was a challenge, a miscalculation, a wrong spark, and the northern Pacific would be stained with blood. It was in this context that a key man intervened, British General James Douglas, governor of the colony of Vancouver. Douglas was pragmatic and understood that a war with the United States would be disastrous for the British Empire, especially while its forces were engaged elsewhere in the world. He ordered that no British troop should fire unless first attacked. Meanwhile, President James Buchanan sent envoys with similar instructions: avoid any action that could be interpreted as a provocation. Thus, the conflict was suspended in a kind of military limbo. Both sides established permanent camps on opposite sides of the island, and for years coexisted in a tense but peaceful manner. British and American soldiers played cricket and baseball, exchanged tobacco and whiskey, and teased one another in a friendly way while waiting for a political resolution that seemed never to arrive. The Pig War, as it was already mockingly called, became a symbol of restraint. Neither empire wished to retreat, yet neither was willing to fight seriously. It was a frozen war, a sort of pride duel sustained by bayonets that were never fired. Behind this tense calm, however, hid a game of global power. The British Empire feared losing influence on the Pacific coast, while the United States dreamed of complete control from California to Alaska. The San Juan Islands seemed insignificant in appearance, but represented a strategic point for dominating maritime routes and projecting power over the continent's northwest. For that reason, although the conflict appeared ludicrous, it was in fact a precursor to the geopolitical disputes that would mark the centuries to come. When the situation finally reached the ears of London and Washington, both governments grasped the absurdity of it all. No one wanted a direct confrontation, much less over a dead animal. It was then agreed to maintain a temporary joint occupation until international arbitration could determine the true border. That seemingly simple decision turned the war into an unprecedented diplomatic episode. Even so, soldiers remained there for over a decade. 2 flags flew over the same island, 2 anthems were sung at different dawns, and men who had once been ready to kill each other ended up sharing stories by the fire. In retrospect, it seemed a farce, a geopolitical comedy in the midst of the most violent century of the modern world. But it was also a lesson. Even the most powerful empires could stop at the edge of the abyss and choose not to fire. The echo of that tension continued to resonate long after. Future generations would see the Pig War not merely as a curious anecdote, but as a reminder that history is not always shaped by great heroes or epic battles, but also by small gestures, acts of restraint, and moments when someone simply says, "Do not fire." For more than a decade, the San Juan Islands remained in a strange equilibrium, neither entirely British nor fully American. They were a shared territory where both sides had learned to coexist. At one end of the island, the flag of the British Empire flew over the English camp, where British Marines maintained their routines with Victorian discipline. At the other end, the stars and stripes rose over the American camp, where American soldiers, more relaxed, pitched their tents, cultivated small gardens, and organized baseball games that sometimes ended with the British as spectators. That forced coexistence, as improbable as it was peaceful, lasted far longer than anyone had imagined. In fact, it endured for 12 years. Over time, the absurdity of the conflict became evident even to the most stubborn. Neither government was willing to spend more money or prestige maintaining a garrison on a handful of remote Pacific islands, yet the territorial question remained unresolved. The maritime border between Canada and the United States was still undefined, and in the meantime, the troops remained there, greeting one another each morning, waiting for an order that never came. It was then decided to seek a definitive diplomatic solution. In 1871, the United States and the United Kingdom signed the Washington Treaty, a broad agreement resolving several pending disputes between the two countries, claims for damages from the American Civil War, fishing rights in the North Atlantic, and, of course, the San Juan Islands dispute. Both powers agreed to submit the case to international arbitration, and to guarantee absolute neutrality, they chose an unexpected mediator, Wilhelm I of Germany, known as the Kaiser. The Kaiser was by then one of the most powerful figures in Europe. Under his rule, Germany had unified, defeated France, and consolidated itself as an emerging power. His role as arbitrator was an opportunity to present himself to the world as a guarantor of peace and balance, something the young German Empire needed to legitimize itself. From his palace in Berlin, Wilhelm I accepted the task and convened an international commission to examine the case. The process was exhaustive. Old maps were reviewed, copies of the Oregon Treaty consulted, statements from sailors and explorers examined, and even meteorological reports describing the navigability of the channels between the islands analyzed. The debate focused, as at the start, on a seemingly simple question with enormous consequences, which was the channel that separates the continent from Vancouver Island. The British argued it was the Rosario Strait, closer to the Canadian coast. The Americans insisted on the Haro Strait, further west, which would place the San Juan Islands within their territory. For months, delegates from both countries presented their arguments with almost surgical precision. The British, relying on naval tradition, argued that the Rosario Strait had historically been more frequently used and was therefore the more logical choice for the boundary. The Americans, meanwhile, presented new cartographic studies and navigation evidence showing that the Haro Strait was deeper, wider, and, above all, safer for maritime traffic. It was a battle of maps, a duel of ink and parchment, where every line drawn could change the fate of thousands of square kilometers of territory. Finally, on the 21st of October, 1872, the Kaiser delivered his verdict. After analyzing all the evidence, he ruled in favor of the United States. The Haro Strait would be officially recognized as the border between the two countries, and the San Juan Islands would definitively come under American control. It was a decision celebrated in Washington and accepted with resignation in London. The United Kingdom, though losing the territory, understood that maintaining a good relationship with the United States was far more important than retaining a few remote islands. The transition was surprisingly peaceful. British troops lowered their flag for the last time at the English camp on the 25th of November, 1872. In a solemn but unresentful ceremony, the Marines saluted their American counterparts, shook hands, and embarked for Vancouver Island. At the American camp, soldiers watched silently as the British ship disappeared into the fog, marking the end of an era. No shots had been fired, no human lives lost. And yet the conflict had lasted more than a decade. That resolution set a historic precedent. It was one of the first successful cases of modern international arbitration, where two powers decided to resolve a territorial dispute without resorting to war. In an age when empires usually settle their differences with blood and fire, the San Juan Islands example was seen as a sign of political maturity. In fact, many historians consider this episode to have laid the groundwork for what would later become the diplomatic system that gave rise to institutions such as the League of Nations and, subsequently, the United Nations. But beyond its legal importance, the Pig War left a symbolic legacy. It demonstrated that human conflicts can arise from the most insignificant reasons and still jeopardize the stability of entire nations. It also showed that reason can prevail even in the most absurd moments. Instead of heroes or martyrs, this story starred farmers, sailors, and ordinary soldiers who somehow understood that it was not worth killing or dying for pride. Over time, the San Juan Islands became a place of memory. The former camps were transformed into historical parks, visited by curious onlookers and tourists who are still astonished by the story of the pig that almost caused a war. At the spot where Lyman Cutler fired his shotgun, there now stands a small commemorative plaque. There are no grand monuments or statues of generals, only a simple inscription recalling the incident and a phrase that encapsulates the spirit of the entire story: only the pig died. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of this episode, to understand that sometimes the most ridiculous conflicts reveal profound truths about human nature, ambition, pride, fear of ridicule, the need to be right. All these impulses can escalate to absurd levels, yet there is also the capacity to step back, recognize limits, and choose reason over violence. In a century when war seemed inevitable, this small dispute showed that peace can sometimes prevail through simple common sense. Thus ended the Pig War, a story that began with a shot on a farm and concluded with a signature in a European palace. No cannon roared, no flag was burned, and yet the episode remained etched as an eternal reminder of what happens when empires clash over trivialities, and of what can be achieved when pride yields to prudence. When one looks at the Pig War with the distance of time, the first thing that strikes the observer is how absurd it seems. Two empires on the brink of war over the death of an animal. Yet, on closer inspection, the episode reveals much more than a mere diplomatic mistake or an excess of national pride. What truly occurred in the San Juan Islands was a snapshot of human behavior, a miniature representation of how conflicts are born and how history, time and again, is driven more by emotions than by reason. At its core, the Pig War was not about territories or treaties, but about perception and pride. Each side saw in the other a threat to its authority, an affront that could not go unanswered. For the British, allowing an American settler to kill a British animal without punishment was a humiliation. For the Americans, accepting that a British farmer or Crown authorities could arrest one of their citizens was an intolerable violation of sovereignty. In both cases, what was truly at stake was not the pig, but the image of power. Curiously, this is a pattern repeated in countless conflicts throughout history. Entire wars have been sparked by symbols, gestures, or incidents that seemed trivial. A single shot in Sarajevo unleashed the First World War, a sunken ship altered the course of the Second, a diplomatic insult or a misaligned flag has been enough to drag nations into the abyss. In that sense, the Pig War serves as an enduring warning. Great conflagrations can begin with a ridiculous spark. Against all odds, this absurd conflict did not end in tragedy, but in diplomacy. It was an early example of what might be called collective intelligence in times of crisis. Neither soldiers nor officers wished to be responsible for a war they knew was unjustifiable. Even politicians, so prone to inflating patriotic rhetoric, understood that there was no glory in fighting over a pig. That understanding, so simple, so human, altered the course of events. If one reflects on it, what happened in the San Juan Islands is a small demonstration of humanity's capacity to pause at the edge of the abyss. It is a story in which reason prevailed, something rare in the 19th century, an era marked by imperial expansion, colonial wars, and an obsession with national superiority. Where others might have chosen the cannon, both British and Americans chose dialogue. And that transforms this seemingly minor episode into a milestone of political maturity. It can also be interpreted from another perspective. The Pig War was a dispute over ownership of the world. In the 19th century, the planet was being divided, mapped, and classified. Every line on a map represented power, influence, and commerce, and in that process of global domination, even the smallest islands could hold immense symbolic value. The San Juan Islands were not merely a piece of land, they were a declaration of who commanded the Pacific. In that sense, the conflict reflects humanity's obsession with drawing borders, with precisely defining where mine ends and yours begins. Paradoxically, in the end, that boundary was decided not by force, but by words, a treaty, a map, a signature, a German emperor acting as a neutral judge between two nations that, only decades before, had been enemies. It is almost poetic that the most absurd war of the 19th century was resolved by one of the most civilized acts of its time, arbitration. Some historians view this case as an early experiment in diplomatic globalization. Long before the United Nations or the International Court of Justice existed, there was already an idea in the air. Conflicts between nations could be resolved through argumentation and mediation. What occurred in 1872 with the Kaiser's ruling was more than a territorial decision. It was a symbol that power need not always be expressed through violence. Even more fascinating is how history has remembered the event. In the United States, the Pig War is often taught as a humorous anecdote, a curiosity in history books. In the United Kingdom, it is scarcely mentioned, as an example of prudent diplomacy, but for the inhabitants of the San Juan Islands, that episode is part of their identity. The ruins of the English and American camps remain preserved as historical parks. Every summer, volunteers recreate the soldiers' uniforms, raise the flags, and reenact the tense days that nearly altered the course of the continent, all to remind that war can be avoided, even when the whole world expects it to erupt. Beyond history, the Pig War also offers a philosophical reading. It is a parable about ego, about how pride can drive us to absurdity. The dead pig was nothing more than a catalyst, an excuse to expose the insecurities of empires. It reminds us that the greatest conflicts sometimes arise not from scarcity or necessity, but from the desire to assert oneself, to refuse to yield, to demonstrate superiority. In that sense, it is a mirror in which any society can look and ask itself, how often are we willing to risk everything just to avoid appearing weak? There are also those who interpret the episode as a lesson in historical maturity. The 19th century was full of seemingly inevitable wars, yet here, for once, another path was chosen. That path, the path of patience, dialogue, and reason, foreshadowed the principles that would later underpin modern diplomacy. It is possible that, unwittingly, the Pig War contributed more to peace than many conferences and treaties signed afterwards. Ultimately, the conflict demonstrates something essential. History is not defined solely by great victors or battlefields, but also by the moments when the world decides not to fight. In that silence, in that restraint, there is heroism. Perhaps that is why, among the many wars of the 19th century, this small dispute stands out not for its violence, but for its sensibility. A war without deaths, a victory of reason over absurdity. and a lesson as relevant today as it was more than a century and a half ago. The sound of the shot that killed that pig in 1859 has long since been lost in the winds of the North Pacific, yet its echo still resonates, not because of the act itself, but for what it represented, the most fragile border separating reason from pride, diplomacy from disaster. What began with a hungry animal devouring potatoes ended up being one of the strangest examples of restraint in modern military history. In the years that followed, both countries came to understand that this tiny island, shrouded in fog and silence, had become a symbol of something far greater. The border question was not resolved immediately. For more than a decade, the United States and the United Kingdom maintained troops on San Juan, sharing the territory like neighbors who tolerated each other without truly liking one another. Years passed, soldiers rotated, and gradually the incident became a military legend told with laughter. Yet beneath that apparent calm, the question remained alive: to whom did the islands truly belong? In 1872, more than a decade after the initial shot, both governments decided to submit the dispute to international arbitration. The chosen mediator was Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany, a man seeking at the time to project his image as an arbiter of global peace. After months of reviewing documents, testimonies, and contradictory maps, the Kaiser issued his ruling. The San Juan Islands would officially become United States territory. The United Kingdom accepted the outcome without major protest. And so, with the signing of a single document, a conflict that had once threatened to ignite a war came to a definitive end. There were no heroes, no parades, no monuments, only the memory of a pig, made the unwitting protagonist of an episode that bordered on the absurd and the tragic at the same time. But behind the humor lies a lesson that remains relevant. The Pig War is a lesson in how human conflicts can arise from the most insignificant causes. A pig crossing a fence can become the trigger for a war when egos and flags weigh more than common sense, yet it also demonstrates that even in moments of the highest tension, there is always the possibility to step back before the abyss. Prudence, though it may appear as weakness, is often the most powerful form of courage. The echo of the pig continues to resonate whenever a nation raises its voice over a border, a symbol, or a minor offense. In a world where networks, speed, and indignation govern narratives, this forgotten episode reminds us that not every provocation deserves a violent response. True power lies not in who fires first, but in who manages not to fire at all. Some historians even see the Pig War as a metaphor for the evolution of the 19th century toward a new world order, the transition from an era of conquests to a time of diplomacy. The United States, still divided internally, learned that force should be exercised with restraint. And the British Empire, which had conquered half the planet, understood that its power was better sustained through prudence than through constant expansion. Both gained something more valuable than territory: they gained a precedent. From that moment on, disputes between the two powers would be resolved almost exclusively through diplomatic means. That small island became, unintentionally, a silent turning point. Today, the site of the conflict is a historic park. Visitors can walk among the remains of the old camps and see the cannons that were never fired. Sometimes, local guides recount the story of the pig with a smile, as if it were an exaggerated joke. But when evening falls and the wind rustles through the trees, one can imagine the weight of what nearly occurred: the roar of two empires ready to destroy each other over an animal that didn't even know whose potatoes it was eating. And perhaps that is the greatest moral of all. Human history, in its grandeur and its folly, is made of both wars and accidents. Nations, like men, stumble over their own pride, and sometimes, a single act of restraint can be worth more than all victories. Thus ends the story of the Pig War, an episode as unusual as it is revealing, where the fate of the world nearly hinged between flesh and reason, for in the end, the pig died. But sanity survived. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed learning about this extraordinary event, please consider subscribing for more videos about forgotten moments in history. There are countless stories like this one, brief, fascinating, and full of lessons about power, ambition, and humanity. Until next time, I'm your narrator, and this was The Dead Pig That Almost Started a War.